2 weeks ago, and kind of following the path that we started with Elijah and what his prophecy and work was in 1 Kings, and then continuing with his story and the story of Elijah as it starts in 2 Kings. And now we end up going to what Paul is telling us in Galatians. But as Paul finishes his sentence in Galatians 3:11, we see that he is using the words of the prophet Habakkuk to make his point. And the significance of who Habakkuk was is when Elijah offered the lady that had been allowing him to stay on her property, he had mentioned to her, "You've never asked me for anything. What is it that you want?" And she responds, "Well, there's nothing I need and there's nothing I want." And then the servant speaks up and says, "She doesn't have a child. I bet a son would be nice." So Elijah looks at the woman and says, "1 year from today, you will have a son." And that son grows up to be the prophet that we just referenced, that Paul is using his words to talk to the churches in Galatia. And we have a Paul before us this morning who is very upset with what is going on in Galatia. We can tell because his normal letter introductions are not what he follows here, and he gets right to the heart of the issue. And what is going on in those churches is some first century Jewish people who have converted to Christianity have come to those churches and said two things. That yes, Jesus is the Messiah, but if you don't follow Deuteronomic law, then you're not an actual follower correctly of God. And they were getting things stirred up in those churches, and then people convinced that they were right. And then I think what would be the added sting for Paul is what they also said about him. You know, the guy that you've been listening to is not a real apostle. So Paul immediately gets a letter of urgency to Galatia because he knows what legalism can do to a religion. He saw it firsthand with his work in Judaism. He's trying to keep Christianity from going down that same path. And why this, I think, is so applicable today, no matter what organized religion you're looking at, legalism has a way of creeping in. And what we mean by legalism is rules and rituals and customs that are not laid out in Scripture that are required to be followed in order to serve in that denomination or to worship in that denomination. So Paul is being quite sincere as well as quite smart. If you want to follow an Old Testament teaching, let me give you one in this letter from Habakkuk. It was true in 600 BC when Habakkuk wrote it. It's true in 65 AD, about the time Paul would be writing this letter. It's even true in what caused Martin Luther to start the Reformation movement. It was this legalism that they see around them that needs to be quenched, because what Habakkuk is telling the people of yesteryear, what Paul is telling the people in his letter before us this morning, and what Martin Luther was telling us just a few hundred years ago is there's two ways to be saved. And the first is you got to have faith in God. And the second way that leads to salvation is from God's grace, because none of us will earn our right to be there. It's only because we believe in our Creator and who He is and what He does and our relationship with Him that allows for God's grace to be poured on us so that we are saved. Because we have a unique situation if we look back into Habakkuk's words. It's a 3-chapter book. And in the first book, the first chapter, he's asking questions that at some point in our life we've probably asked. God of mercy and love and grace, how can you allow evil and murder and all these terrible things in your world? And we see something very beautiful happen in this Old Testament book. We see how a prophet engages with God and then has a conversation with God. And what has made Habakkuk's heart so heavy is not only is Judah about to be punished, God's going to use the Assyrians to do the punishment. And that seems to sting with Habakkuk as much as anything, is who's going to be the instrument of the Lord. But then when we get in chapter 2 of his book, and when we look at verse 4 as we did this morning, which is really the apex of the message he's delivering, we see God's response. We see how he responds in that when you're dealing with an arrogant group, in this case it would be the Assyrians, when you're dealing with that group of people, there's never enough for them. They cannot conquer enough land. They cannot pillage enough property. The gold in the world is not enough. And while we don't see people like this necessarily getting what we think is just punishment at the right time, what God is saying is they start dying from the inside. And the irony of a group of people like this is they don't even know it. But for those who believe will live, because evil will not have the final say. God has final say in all things. So if we as a people, whether it's back in 600 BC or in Paul's time or Martin Luther's time or today, it's your faith. It's what is going to give you the freedom here on this earth that you long for. And then a peace to know that whatever happens at the end of this journey is not the final say. And that the one who does have a final say is going to allow us to be in his continual presence for eternity. Paul, in his letter, is trying to explain justification by faith. That is a big belief in Christianity and Methodism in particular, that it is only by justification by faith that we enter into the kingdom of heaven, because of the two things mentioned earlier, of faith in God and God's grace. So when Paul uses this, we see that he is attempting to settle a dispute that should have never arisen. Because as they were on their early journey in the first century, they had been given what they needed in order to be successful followers of Christ. But their situation is no less unique than ours in that we know the same things. We have probably been set on the same paths for success. But some disruption comes into our lives that attempts to get us off that path and distracted. And we see that this is what has happened in Martin Luther's life, the man who's probably done more for Christianity in the last 500 years than anyone. He did not like what he saw going on in the Catholic Church at that time. I can buy indulgences from the church, and it will reduce the amount of punishment for my sin. And Martin Luther says that's not in either testament. That is not what we believe. So he started a movement that was dramatically different than what people were accustomed to. And the point of the sermon this morning is faith. It's the same point of the sermon we had in July when I first got my appointment here. Because whether you look at Elijah, whether you look at Elisha, whether you look at Habakkuk, Paul, or Martin Luther, these were ordinary men who had impeccable faith, who were willing to listen to the Lord, willing to go where that journey led, and they were not opposed to making some sacrifices along that journey. We can all find our own story in these pages of Scripture because we're all so much alike. These were broken, sinful people who were called to do something, and they did it. And we're all here for a very similar reason, whether it's as monumental as what Elijah did in his work in life, or what we are called to do. But you're uniquely made in order that you can follow through with that purpose God has for you. And whether it's us looking at Matthew 3 years ago and trying to cultivate a faith stronger than wind, or looking to the wisdom of both Paul and the Old Testament this morning, which tells us that if you live by faith, you shall live. And when we do that, the world around us and what we are capable of doing dramatically changes. And we can really immerse ourselves in becoming not only devoted followers of Christ, but instruments for Christ in the world around us. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the beliefs that we have and who we follow. If you want to be an active participant in God's kingdom here on earth, you can become an active participant. He will use you as an instrument to do his will. And the only thing that will limit any of us and what our abilities are will be limited by our amount of faith. But when we can look back easily at multiple places in the Bible and say, this is what can happen when faith is strong, let us draw strength from these stories so that with that strength, we can be instruments of Christ, capable of doing things beyond our independent control. And that's the good news this morning. Thank you.